My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
Hey folks, it's Kelly McFarland again, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to another episode of America at 250, which is our journey through different inflection points in the history of America in the world. Today, I'm excited to be joined by author, historian, and journalist Stephen Kinzer, who's reported from all over the world and published over 10 books covering U.S. foreign policy. And I was just talking to him before we started recording, and I think I've probably read about half of those, and actually saw him give a book talk on his book on the Dulles brothers when he did so at the State Department back in like 2013 or 2014. But today, we're going to be talking about his 2017 book, The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire, which was published by Henry Holt and Company. And the book centers around the debates between imperialism and anti-imperialism that shaped American foreign policy and identity at the birth of the 20th century. I encourage you to pick up the book. It's a great read anytime, but especially it's July 1st we're recording this, so it's a great beach read if you're looking for something over the summer months. And you can find a link to that in our show notes. But Stephen, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Hi, it's good to be here, especially to talk about The True Flag, which just between us girls is probably my favorite book of all the 10 I've written. I think I uncovered an interesting chapter. It fascinated me just to be able to uncover that and write about it.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating, and a lot of big characters, which also makes it an interesting thing to research and write as well. And we'll get into those large characters in a minute. But so to start us off, the book, focuses around the Spanish-American War of 1898 and how we got into that, and then where the United States was going to go following that, and how we were going to react, with these certain areas that we had been invading and maybe taking over and everything. Hence the discussions between imperialists and anti-imperialists. But in order to understand that, can you give us a little bit of background on, what was the Spanish-American War? What got us into this?
In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared the American frontier closed.
Yep.
So there was no more room to expand. Now, Americans have been expanding ever since the Pilgrims moved from Plymouth to Boston. So the Americans had to face a question. Do we now, having fulfilled our manifest destiny, which was to fill up North America, turn inward and try to develop our society? Or do we do what we've been doing since the founding, which is expanding? At the end of the 19th century, specifically in the spring of 1898, partly fueled by the new phenomenon of yellow journalism and the mass press, Americans became fascinated by what they saw as brutal Spanish oppression of its colony in Cuba. And the Cuban commander there was turned into the epitome of evil in the minds of Americans. So there erupted this cry of humanitarian need to go and rescue the suffering Cubans from the oppression of Spain. This coincided neatly with the desire of a number of imperialists in Washington, including Theodore Roosevelt, who were eager to expand American power. Push America into a position of a colonial nation similar to the colonial powers of Europe. So all of this together led the United States finally to decide that we would send troops to Cuba to aid revolutionaries who were already fighting a war to overthrow Spanish rule. Much to our horror and surprise, we discovered that the rebel leaders were a little bit uncertain about whether they wanted our help. They were worried about what might happen after the war was over with a large American force on their soil. As a result of these fears, the U.S. Congress responded by passing an amendment called the Teller Amendment, in which we explicitly proclaimed our commitment to withdraw from Cuba entirely and leave its government to its own people as soon as the Spanish were overthrown. So with that commitment made with the force of law, the United States troops were welcomed in Cuba. Soon afterwards, Spain surrendered. And as that war was going on, one of the concerns in the minds of American military strategists was that the Spanish Navy might retaliate by attacking targets somewhere in the United States. So we had to locate the Spanish Navy. It was not in Spain. It was not around Cuba. And we finally found it in a place that no American had ever heard of.
Right.
That was the Philippine Islands. So a squadron under Commodore Dewey was sent out to destroy the Spanish fleet, which it did in Manila Harbor. But then came the question, who rules the Philippines? Now the Spanish are gone. They'd been there for centuries. And this also tantalized the imagination of American imperialists.
Oh, yeah.
At the same time, we had a group in America that was horrified at the idea that a country that had formerly been a colony and had proclaimed its determination to support freedom for all peoples would begin to take colonies itself. And that clash is at the heart of my book, The True Flag.
Yeah, and we'll get into the sort of the anti-imperial angle of this in a moment and the discussions that were going on. But turning to the imperialists to start, and sort of their justifications for doing what they end up doing. You've got Roosevelt, you've got Lodge, they're reading Mahan and the influence of sea power on history, which is, fitting perfectly into their mindset and giving them this, academic thing to use as an example and everything as to why we needed to do this, we being the United States. But what is behind the arguments of Roosevelt and Lodge in this imperialist endeavor that they're talking about? Was this just, raw romantic nationalism? When you heavily quote Roosevelt in the book, rightfully so. Was this a calculated geopolitical strategy, or, how much of this was tied to this personal philosophy that he has, that, the strenuous life and things like that? Was it, were these two separate things, or were they molding together along with the thoughts of folks like Henry Cabot Lodge and trying to fit the United States into this geopolitical path towards greatness?
I think various strains came together. One was a kind of romantic nationalism, particularly personified by Roosevelt. Both he and Lodge had grown up and, as young boys, gone down to harbors and played with boats and developed this fascination with naval power. Roosevelt also absolutely adored the idea of war. He felt that only people that went to war were real men, and only nations that were warlike were deserving of survival. So that's one piece of it. In addition, there was tremendous commercial pressure for America to find new markets for domestic production. So by the end of the 19th century, American agriculture had become so efficient, and American factories had become so efficient that they were producing more than the country could consume. In those days, you couldn't trade with a lot of other countries if they were colonized by some other power, because one of the reasons countries took colonies was to guarantee themselves a monopoly on trade with that country. So the only way the United States could break into that circle would be to take colonies of its own. When I was researching The True Flag and reading newspapers of that era, there was one word that kept constantly coming up in the discussions about the national economy, and that was glut. We have too much stuff. We've got to find foreign markets or our nation will collapse. President McKinley's very last speech, an hour before he was assassinated, is on this very subject. We're looking for foreign markets. So that was another piece that overlaid.
And it's coming right on the heels of the greatest panic in American history to that point, the Panic of 1893. So there, there's fears of something like that happening again if there is this glut.
In addition, I would say there's a kind of racist assumption behind expansionism. You can see this very clearly in some of the quite shocking quotes from Roosevelt particularly, but also other imperialists in their contempt for non-white peoples. So all of these factors overlaid. And then his history provided opportunities. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote later that after the Spanish fleet was destroyed in Manila Harbor, it took him about 24 hours to grasp the enormity of what this meant. That's 7,000 islands in between the United States and China. Yeah. So it was an enormous step. And I have to say that the China market was a kind of a fata morgana, a great mirage out there.
Yeah.
There were articles in the American press talking about if the Chinese could be persuaded to eat bread made out of wheat, how much wheat could the U.S. sell to China? If they would be persuaded to eat beef, how much beef could we sell there? If they would use nails in construction, how many nails per year could we sell there? So the Philippines opened up this whole new territory to the United States. And I think all this together made it irresistible.
Yeah. And, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the Philippines. And, this is something on the surface of it, you're thinking, we're trying to get the Spanish out of Cuba. We end up going to the Philippines because we want to destroy their fleet, like you mentioned. But the Philippines ends up becoming sort of the center of the debate as time goes on. Talk about what happens sort of, the treaties signed with the Spanish, that all goes, who was it? Was it Elihu Root or John Hay that called it a splendid little war?
John Hay,
yeah, in the summer of 1898. So that it all goes fairly quickly, but then you have an insurgency that kicks off in the Philippines, which then gives more and more fodder to these anti-imperialists that we'll talk about in a minute. But, why is that the case? What happens in the Philippines after we sign this treaty?
It's a fascinating story, and it's one that's little known in the United States. Wait a minute.
I hope they're not coming for you.
Most guys don't use sirens.
Yeah.
The Philippines story is a fascinating one, and it's not largely known in the United States. I really enjoy telling that story as I do in my book because it sets a pattern. The whole point of this book, as I make clear at the very end, is to show that this debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists, or interventionists and anti-interventionists that we're having today and that we had during Vietnam, during Iraq, these themes keep repeating themselves. This debate that I write about in The True Flag is the beginning of all these debates. And there has never been a single argument raised in any of these debates over American intervention abroad that was not first made by one side or the other in 1898.
Right.
And that's why I find this whole story so fascinating. Now, the pattern that the Philippines experience sets is one that resonates through the history of American intervention. And it's this: the United States has the military power to achieve overwhelming victory. We achieve the result we want, but that only is truly successful if history stops happening.
Right.
If we can hold everything right there. But unfortunately, history keeps on unfolding. And later on, we have to pay a price that we never imagined for many of these interventions. So to talk about what happened in the Philippines, there already was an insurrection going on in the Philippines against Spanish rule when the United States arrived and shot and destroyed the Spanish fleet. Commodore Dewey actually met with Aguinaldo, the leader of the Filipino rebels, and supplied him with weapons. There's some debate about what they actually agreed on, but the Americans did supply Aguinaldo with rifles, the idea being that they would fight on the ground and the Americans would fight at sea. When the Spanish fleet was destroyed, President McKinley was faced with a terrible decision that he never wanted to make.
Right.
He later wrote, if only Dewey had sailed away after sinking that fleet, what a lot of trouble he would have saved us.
Well, I think it's important to note the role that TR played in this too, right? Like you make the story you tell is, fairly well known for, I guess, folks like me, but the one day that his boss is gone, he sets all of this in motion, right?
It's true. The Secretary of the Navy took a day off. Roosevelt filled in for him and started ordering ships and ordering recruitments and moving warships into position. And that's an example of how important individuals are in the shaping of history. So the Spanish were quick to surrender in the Philippines, although the Spanish commander wanted to be sure to surrender to the United States, not to Aguinaldo. So it wouldn't seem like Spain had been defeated by a bunch of ragtag rebels, but rather by a great army. But then, soon afterward, it became clear that the United States was not going to permit the Philippines to emerge as an independent country. People in Washington, like Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt, thought it was absolutely ludicrous to believe that the people in the Philippines would be able to govern themselves. And on the other hand, the anti-imperialists rose up and saw this as the actual Rubicon. This is the place where we have to stop American expansion. Otherwise, we're going to be going all over the world. And that led to the emergence of the most powerful anti-imperialist movement in American history, which is the subject of my book, The True Flag. However, the conflict then between Aguinaldo and the Americans was something I don't think McKinley ever expected.
Definitely not, yeah.
A brutal war broke out, which was actually nothing more than a series of massacres because the Americans were armed with firearms and the locals more or less had only machetes and spears. Over the course of a couple of years, something like 200,000 Filipinos died or were killed in political violence and war. Americans have completely forgotten that this war ever happened, but it sparked a nationwide debate. It was the treaty about taking the Philippines. Our treaty with Spain was debated for 30 days in the U.S. Senate, and newspapers all over the United States were printing the verbatim transcripts of the debates. It was being eagerly followed. And this is why I say that every argument that's been made about whether we should invade Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran all goes back to this original debate.
Yeah. So let's get into that debate because it is so critical to the story you're telling in this book. And as you note, it is so critical for everything that has come since then. And, who were the anti-imperialists and what was their, main argument or what were their main arguments?
One thing that became clear to me as I was working on this book is that it was the young generation that pressed for imperialism.
Yeah.
Actually, imperialism was something radically new, and you could argue alien or even hostile to the American tradition. After all, we were a country that was committed to self-government. So if we believe that all people should govern themselves, how do we justify taking foreign colonies? The violence of massacres in the Philippines also intensified anti-imperialist sentiment, very much the way stories from Vietnam affected the anti-war movement some decades later. So the American campaign was exceedingly brutal, and it ultimately produced a clear colonial relationship. The United States took the Philippines as a colony, ruled by a military officer appointed by the President of the United States. And the Philippines remained a colony of the United States right up until the Second World War. So the arguments of the anti-imperialists were centered around American tradition. This is an un-American thing to do, to take over other countries and force a government on them that they don't choose. The other side was arguing essentially, this is the inevitable course of history, that the more powerful, more intelligent, more endowed races will subdue the poor, unprepared peoples and wait some centuries while we prepare them for self-government. So the debate centered on American identity.
Mm-hmm.
What are we as a nation? Will we become just one more bully in a world of bullies, as one anti-imperialist put it? Or will we become like one of the nations that has blessed the world with its civilization, like the British and the Germans? Couldn't we also spread what we have to other countries and in the meantime enrich ourselves? So this argument has reemerged in different forms over the 100 years plus that have followed. And the anti-imperialists have always had powerful arguments, and in some cases won very large followings, but they've never ultimately won the battles.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, American expansion became a template, and it all begins with this episode around 1898.
Yeah. And and who's to say, if the anti-imperialists would have won in 1898, this discussion may well have occurred again in the 1920s, and they could have, you never know what's going to happen after that. But
I could just add, time favored the imperialists because the
Right.
anti-imperialists were a lot of old fogies. They were ones that believed in the old values, and the imperialists were the ones who were saying, things have changed. The world has changed. We've got to be vibrant. We've got to be out there. And for a young nation, that was a very exciting call.
Yeah. How close was it? It seems to me that not only was this the beginning of this debate, but potentially the closest it's ever been.
It's true. So the treaty by which the United States took control of the Philippines and also of Puerto Rico and Guam, under which the Spanish relinquished control of Cuba, was passed by the U.S. Senate with just one vote more than the required 2/3 majority. And that came after a lot of cajoling from the White House. Later on, the anti-imperialists filed a Supreme Court case arguing that it was unconstitutional for the United States to take foreign territories because the Constitution explicitly says that the federal government only has the powers that are granted to it in this document, and there's nowhere in there that empowers the government to take colonies. This Supreme Court decision was decided by one vote. It was a 5-4 vote. And even the Chief Justice who wrote the majority opinion, who had just written the opinion a few years earlier legalizing segregation in the United States, wrote quite clearly in his opinion that if the decision goes the other way, this could really obstruct the course of American empire. So politics was very much involved in that decision. So it was extremely close. On the other hand, thinking of where Americans were at that time and what was happening in the world, it makes me wonder whether actually, in one way or another, the United States would have burst the boundaries of North America because that just was a reflection of the American psyche at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the age of empire, right? And America's growing and already is showing the latent potential for what it would become. I don't know if it may well have been a short-lived success for the anti-imperialists at that time period. But so we've mentioned a couple larger-than-life characters in Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge in his own way, not quite as large as life as Roosevelt. But the one on the side of the anti-imperialists that I found to be fascinating and definitely not something that is remembered about Mark Twain is his leadership in many ways of this crusade, and not at the start, right? I mean, it took him some time to come around to these views, but once he did, he was completely all in and in an eviscerating way in many instances. And you find, some of the documents you have in here are things that were released decades later that he put in his do not publish, not for the public piles, and they are harsh.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that we have a certain image of Mark Twain. I know I did when I started writing The True Flag, and that image is of a kind of kindly old grandfatherly figure rocking on his chair, a lot of kids around him and always telling jokes, maybe not quite all there, but lovable nonetheless. That's not the Mark Twain that comes out from his anti-imperialist campaigns. He was absolutely biting. He was bitter in his denunciation of imperialism. He even suggested, for example, that when the United States creates a flag for the Philippines, we should use our flag, but use black stripes instead of white ones, and then replace the stars with skull and crossbone.
Yeah.
He was vituperative and became something like the bard of the anti-imperialist movement. So both those two figures, Theodore Roosevelt and Mark Twain, were very popular and in many ways quite comparable. They were egomaniacs. They both sort of created an image of themselves, which wasn't real, but they made themselves into a certain kind of persona. Either of them could turn away from a mirror or from a photographer. But there was a big difference between them, and that is that although they both traveled the world, Mark Twain really immersed himself in environments that were non-European. He traveled to Africa, he traveled to Asia. He developed a tremendous sympathy for peoples of those countries, and he despised Roosevelt's attitudes towards lesser peoples. Now, in public, the two of them did not denounce each other because they understood each other's popularity. However, in private, as I found when I was researching this book, Mark Twain refers to Theodore Roosevelt as clearly insane. And Theodore Roosevelt once wrote that he would like to skin Mark Twain alive. So I'm using this rivalry and debate of these very interesting figures as a kind of a leitmotif throughout the True Flag book.
Yeah. Another player that looms large in this, and just to bring this up quickly, because again, it shows the extremely close run nature of this debate in 1898 and then during the presidential election of 1900, is Jennings Bryan, who is running for Democratic nominee for president in 1896, does so again in 1900. And he ends up getting blown out in the election in 1900 by McKinley, and who now has Roosevelt as his running mate. But, and in many ways may have made it a closer race and potentially could have won if he would have dropped the free silver idea that he had of coining silver to make, because he's a populist at heart. And, so talk about his role in this as well, because he also pushes people. He's an anti-imperialist, but he's pushing for the treaty and things as well. So he's a complicated individual in this book.
William Jennings Bryan played a crucial role in this debate. So he emerged as a fiery anti-imperialist. But then in 1900, as you pointed out, he ran for president and included anti-imperialist rhetoric in his platform, but also terrified many Americans with his proposal for free silver, which struck many people as a crackpot idea, and certainly terrified the plutocrats who thought that it would destroy the basis of the American economy. So the anti-imperialists pleaded with Bryan, drop the free silver thing and make this a referendum on imperialism. But Bryan, for his own reasons, couldn't do that. And I think when you look at the what ifs of this debate, Bryan's position really gives you one of the great fantasies about how things might have gone differently.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the book too, there's talks of, these two on paper adamantly opposed to each other individuals, Bryan and Andrew Carnegie, potentially joining because they're both such staunch anti-imperialists, and Carnegie wants Bryan to drop this, but he just can't. He just won't do it in the end. Carnegie, who knows? Again, it's one of these what ifs when you look at history. Like, if Carnegie and some of the other East Coast money individuals would have gotten behind Bryan, what would that have looked like? So, yeah.
It's interesting that the Anti-Imperialist coalition had several different pieces. The main group was Republicans from the North, many of whom were also great advocates of women's suffrage and abolitionism. That, along with anti-imperialism, were thought of as the three great reform causes. Also, however, the anti-imperialist coalition included racist senators from the American South. They were Democrats.
I was going to ask you to expound on the race aspect.
They don't want dark-skinned people to be brought into the United States. Even some labor leaders were worried because they didn't want mass immigration from countries.
Yeah, you mentioned Gompers.
Over. So the coalitions were very varied. Here you have Jane Addams, the great social reformer, and also Andrew Carnegie, who may have been the richest man in the United States. So just like today, you're seeing people on different ends of the political spectrum agreeing that restraint in foreign policy would be a wise policy for us. You also see what you might think of as unlikely coalitions back in this period.
Yeah. So I'll get you out of here on this then. Our last question, sort of bringing this to the present. And you mentioned, that this argument of 1898 through the, basically through the election of 1900 into 1901 sets the stage for all these other arguments and discussions over the course of the next 120 years. Where do you see the legacy of that today?
The American lust for imperial adventures seems to swing back and forth like a pendulum. Sometimes we get very lustful. Other times we get punched in the face and then we kind of pull back. I do think now, however, that the United States population is more and more skeptical of foreign wars and foreign interventions. You see this with resistance to the U.S. support for war in Gaza. There is even opposition to U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. And certainly the Iran war was very unpopular. All of these, I think, contribute to a momentum where people kind of put these things together. We may be approaching some kind of a tipping point. However, that's only a tipping point in the minds of the American people. I truly believe, and surveys suggest this also, that American attitude toward foreign interventions and foreign wars is changing quite dramatically. However, this change has not penetrated into Washington. The power of the defense industry and lobbies for foreign countries is so complete that members of Congress feel kind of immunized and protected from changing attitudes back home. Now we're seeing, as we speak, some interesting results in congressional elections are based in part on these conflicts. So I do think there's a shift in the population and the general American mind about the value of foreign wars and foreign intervention. The next step would be to carry what American people believe into the halls of Congress, which is not always so easy.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things I try to get across to my students all the time is that these discussions that we're having about America's role in the world and, liberal internationalism versus isolationism versus restraint versus offshore balance, whatever term you want to use, these aren't the first time that we've been having these discussions. So it's always good to bring history into the conversation.
Well, that was the exact purpose of my writing this book, to show that the arguments about how the United States should behave in the world are nothing new.
Yes. Well, Stephen, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay. It was great to be with you. Thanks.